everyone, and welcome to After Alexander, Episode 8, The Land of Dionysus. Last time, we saw Seleucus and Antigonus conclude a peace following the unsuccessful invasion attempts of Babylon. These might even have been more of a hindrance than a help to the Antigonid cause in the long run. For example, Demetrius is known to have pillaged and sacked the area around Babylon, which, you can imagine, did not endear the Babylonians to Antigonus or his son. In fact, probably the opposite. Although both Antigonus and Seleucus fortified their respective borders, as neither man was ever going to trust the other, it allowed both men to turn their respective attentions away from each other for at least a while. Specifically, Antigonus looked west again, towards Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus. However, as we saw last time, Seleucus looked east, taking over the Near Eastern provinces of the former empire and absorbing them into his own domains. Like Alexander himself, Seleucus was looking further east still than this. Specifically, his gaze went towards the Jaxartes and Indus rivers, right at the periphery of Alexander's empire. Accordingly, Seleucus decided to invade India. Now, we're going to take the opportunity here to revisit the history of Mauryan India, which we covered back in episode 4, specifically the early period under Chandragupta Maurya rather than a broad sweeping history of the Mauryan Empire. There are two main strands of thought, as far as I can tell, about Chandragupta's birth. The first theory seems to be that he was from low birth, as we don't really hear anything about him in the historical record until the foundation of his state. Alternatively, I've seen it postulated that his father was Savartha Siddhi, a prince of the Nanda. Apologies for any pronunciation there, but really this is my first attempt at this name. I'm not going to offer any definitive statement on Chandragupta's parentage, but just know that both theories do appear to exist. Once Alexander left India, Chandragupta allied himself with a mountain kingdom. Possibly this was the kingdom of Puru, which Alexander had been victorious over, but which had avoided destruction at his hands. Eventually, in 321 BCE, the Nanda capital of Patliputra fell, and the ruler of the empire, Dhanananda, known variously as Agrames or Zandrems to the Greeks, was ousted. At a mere 20 years old, Chandragupta had therefore succeeded in forming his own dynasty. This, you've got to feel, is quite impressive. I don't know what most of us do when we're 20 years old, but I somehow doubt founding empires is one of the activities. Eventually, Seleucus invaded, crossing the Indus and probably doing a bit of victorious crowing as he did so. This would not have been news Chandragupta could have taken lying down, so he marched west and the two seem to have fought. We don't know a lot about what happened during this campaign, but it is speculated that it might not have gone fabulously for Seleucus given what happens next. I've even seen the conflict given from a different perspective on the ThoughtCo website, which argues that Chandragupta decided to invade Persia rather than portraying Seleucus as crossing the Indus. I'm going to stick with a more reliable majority who say that Seleucus invaded India rather than the other way around. However, I think the fact that this interpretation exists might give us some indication of how victorious Chandragupta likely was in the campaigning. The treaty between the two powers, which we mentioned in episode 4, came in 305. I've seen a single source which mentions it as being 301, but the majority agree with the earlier date, and that appears to be the historically accepted one. There appears to have been some kind of marriage clause, as I mentioned last time, but there's quite a bit of uncertainty around this. Possibly, this included a recognition of the validity of all marriage between Indians and Greeks. However, sources also mention the marriage of a Yavana, or Greek, to Chandragupta. This may have been Seleucus's daughter, who I've very occasionally seen called Berenice. However, the long and short is that unfortunately we only have vague details. In addition to whatever this marriage clause was, Chandragupta gave Seleucus 500 Indian elephants to swell the ranks of his army. I'm going to draw your attention to this because, as I may have mentioned last time we focused on this treaty, this is going to be important. There are only two elephant species in the world, namely the Asiatic and African elephants. Asiatic elephants are mostly confined to India and Southeast Asia, while African elephants are exclusively located south of the Sahara Desert. Given the political realities of the day, the other successors were unlikely to be able to match this resource. Ptolemy might be able to get his hands on some African elephants, but really that's about it. This would have been a major boost to Seleucus' armies. However, there were going to be some downsides for Seleucus, instead of just getting some elephants and the prestige of an international marriage. Specifically, he was going to have to give up the easternmost provinces of Alexander's empire, putting an abrupt end to his eastwards rampage. These areas were Gedrosia, now in southern Pakistan, Kabul, and Arachosia. At the time, these may have been considered a natural part of India, which could give the impression that Chandragupta really was thinking about the unification of India as he knew it at the time. To me, at least, this piece indicates that Seleucus knew when to stop. After his peace with India was concluded, he turned his attention elsewhere and didn't mess about with the Indian border anymore. India, after all, was now a far more unified and thus more dangerous force than it had been in Alexander's day. This was only going to increase after the peace treaty, as Chandragupta turned his attention south, and eventually conquered the whole subcontinent apart from the kingdom of Kalinga in the east and the Tamils in the very south. Even then, his grandson Ashoka was going to bring them into the fold as well. In the remaining regions, Seleucus would have had quite a bit of influence, as Apama was Iranian and from the region, meaning that he would have been able to consolidate these areas rather than focusing on attacking the east again. As for Seleucus, affairs in the west were going to demand his attention again. Just because there had been a peace put in place in 309 didn't mean that the threat posed by Antigonus had gone away. As you might be expecting by this point, you all know the drill, the Fourth War of the Successors is looming around the corner. However, that will have to wait for a future episode. Instead, we're going to talk for a bit about how the Greeks perceived India and Indian history, as well as a bit of speculation on my part about the impact of Alexander's conquests. That'll be in part 2, after the interlude. See you then. You'll have noticed from this episode's title, The Land of Dionysus, that the Greeks strongly connected the Indian subcontinent with Dionysus, the god of wine and madness. In fact, this connection will stay in the collective Hellenistic consciousness for over a millennium. To talk about this, I'm going to bring you forward in time to the Eastern Roman Empire. Writing in the now largely Hellenistic, or Greek if you like, Eastern Roman Empire in the 12th century, the Princess Anna Komnene would mention it in her father's biography, the Alexiad. Her perception is that, just as the Straits of Gibraltar in the west were known as the Pillars of Heracles, so were there a matching set called the Pillars of Dionysus to the east. She doesn't explicitly mention India, but you can see that this association of the god Dionysus with the east is clearly present. The Greeks believed that, way back in the mists of time, Dionysus had travelled to and conquered India, and taught the people there how to do things like farm, gave them weapons, taught them to worship the gods, especially himself, as you might imagine, and generally overlorded India. He also founded a number of cities, the absence of which had allowed him to sweep through India so successfully, according to the myth. 15 generations would go by before the arrival of Heracles. If we were to roughly approximate a generation as 30 years, then probably about 450 years have gone by in the myth. He is supposed to have founded Patliputra itself, the capital of first the Nanda and then the Mauryan empires. The descendants of Heracles would become the rulers of India for several generations. These kings were supposed to have not travelled out in expeditions or set up colonies, i.e. daughter cities, further afield, instead mostly staying at home and ruling over their cities. Now, this supposed veneration of Heracles in India may actually refer to veneration of Balarama or Krishna, as the Greeks, like the Romans later on, had a habit of approximating and superimposing their deities onto other cultures as they perceived them. As an aside, when Alexander the Great fought the Indian king known as Porus in India, Porus is supposed to have battle standards which had a likeness of Heracles painted on them. This Heracles is supposed to be a native of India rather than simply the Greek travelling eastward and superimposing himself. After the conquest of Alexander, India likely seemed less far away. After all, as I'm sure we will cover in our narrative, several Hellenistic successor states will remain in the region until close to the start of the Common Era. Where once India might have been a semi-mythical land at the edge of the Persian Empire, it had now become a neighbour. This is conjecture, of course, but it seems likely to me that there must have been a perspective shift connected to all of this, making it seem a lot closer than it had been before. Next time, we're going to have another digression episode. I know that there will be those of you who are only interested in the main narrative, but I'm unfortunately going to put off all the future drama of Ipsus, the crowning of Seleucus and all that, for a little bit longer. Because, as I promised, I'm going to do an episode of what we know, and what we don't, about the family of Seleucus. I know I said I would do this after Seleucus had got the diadem firmly placed on his head. However, given that Antiochus in particular is going to become more relevant from this point on, I thought I might as well do it now. So, that'll be the next episode, the next generation of Seleucid royals. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out to the show at afteralexpod@gmail.com for any questions or comments. Also, feel free to participate in the Alexander the Great poll, as it will be interesting to see what all of you think of him. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.